Good morning, and thank you very much for being here. I'm delighted to join my colleagues at this panel discussion on compliance and to greet you this morning. Looking forward to hearing from these experts in the area of compliance, and we hope that this will be very informative for you. Please participate with us by giving us your questions and comments and joining us in this discussion. The Forum's done a wonderful job of bringing together a distinguished panel of individuals who have great experience in the area of corporate compliance. I'd like to begin by just sharing a few thoughts on the subject, and then we'll get right into the presentations from our great panel here. Corporate compliance is a very fast-growing topic of great interest. It might not have been a subject that would have been on included in an event or a conference like this even 5 years ago. But now it's hard to imagine a discussion involving legal issues globally that doesn't include the subject of corporate compliance. That's how significant it has become for the global legal community, but particularly the business community. If we had to define compliance, I think we might say that it's essentially the system of controls or system of policies and procedures companies establish in order to meet expectations of governments. Ethics, to distinguish it from compliance, has to do with the values of individuals and the company together, those individuals together, the commitment to doing the right thing, but not easy to see or not very tangible. Compliance is the tangible side of ethics. Compliance is the way that ethics is demonstrated through very practical mechanisms to ensure that the ethics are actually real, that they make a difference, an impact in the life of a global company in particular. So corporate compliance, again, is a system of controls that are put in place to meet these growing expectations of regulators. It might be expectations involving corruption or competition, trade, data privacy, whatever the issue. As enforcement increases, as regulations increase, companies have to adjust to that by putting together programs that will ensure that they prevent misconduct if at all possible. There are a couple of real milestones in the compliance area. One key milestone was 20 years ago, the United States Sentencing Commission established a list of elements for effective compliance. The Sentencing Commission of the United States said that if a company had 7 elements, met the description that was provided for compliance, when a company was punished, it would receive some benefit for its compliance program. And that really started a new way of thinking about building compliance to mitigate or reduce the penalty that might be experienced by a company in an enforcement action. Then the OECD, about 4 years ago or so, provided a list of best practices in the area of anti-corruption, 13 good practices. And those 13 practices were very similar to the Sentencing Commission's 7 elements, but with more detail, and specifically referring to such things as due diligence in relation to the retention of third parties and other more practical elements of compliance. Now, the significance of those OECD best practices can be seen by the U.S. Department of Justice as it settles cases with companies in the area of corruption. It regularly now includes a list of requirements for compliance as a part of the settlement agreement that tracks the OECD's 13 good practices. An interesting development. Perhaps we can get more thoughts on that from Lanny Brewer in a moment, but it tracks those OECD elements and almost item by item. And so it shows how compliance has an international feel to it. And then more recently, the UK completed its work on the Bribery Act and issued guidance on what it means to have adequate procedures for preventing corruption. And those adequate procedures under the UK Bribery Act will actually allow a company to avoid criminal liability altogether, which is a very interesting concept. And the guidance that was put out by the Ministry of Justice in the UK is very helpful in understanding what corporate compliance should involve. So we have the sentencing guidelines in the US, we have the OECD's good practices, we have the UK Bribery Act 6 principles for compliance, and there are many other lists, but all together they give us a sense of what corporate compliance is all about. One of the things we want to talk about today is the growing expectation of regulators regarding compliance. In my own practice, I work at a law firm of Baker McKenzie and chair our global compliance and investigations practice. And in the past few months, I've made 4 presentations to the prosecutors that report ultimately to Laney Brewer. And in those meetings, I've been asked questions by those prosecutors about the compliance program of the companies that I'm representing in those meetings. And those questions are very specific about what the company has done to prevent the problem being discussed. That's more common as we go forward. We see that year by year the expectations increasing. And that's because if a company comes to the authorities, not just the U.S. authorities, but to any enforcement authority and says, you know, our company's a good company. We have tried to do the right thing. We have a long history of strong values. The reaction more and more is, well, show me, demonstrate that. Where's the evidence of this great culture that you're describing? Do you have a compliance program that puts that into action, that can be more tangible for us to see? And so it's more and more a part of the conversation with regulators. Now, we understand that we're all trying to avoid the issues of misconduct that are so common. Again, corruption and antitrust violations and other violations of law. And it seems as though the best way to achieve that goal is to encourage compliance. That effort of self-policing will do more than any government enforcement action can ever accomplish. And so one of the subjects of today's discussion is how can governments encourage compliance? Because the more self-policing, the more compliance efforts, the further we will go in actually achieving the prevention of misconduct. But if companies think that governments don't really give credit or recognize compliance efforts, they may not be encouraged to make the effort to build the programs, to spend the money, especially in these difficult economic times. So there's an overview of some of the subjects we want to talk about today, what programs are like. We're going to hear from company insiders who have their own compliance programs and can describe what's been done. We'll hear from the senior official at the Department of Justice as to the U.S. perspective on corporate compliance. And we'll even hear from someone who looks at these issues from the outside from the perspective of organizations that promote and encourage compliance. So I'm delighted to have such a distinguished panel. And what we're going to do is receive the presentations of each panelist one by one, and at the end of each presentation I'll introduce the next speaker, and we'll save your questions until the end. We hope to leave at least 30 minutes at the end for discussion, so if you hear something that you want to pursue, please take note of that and we'll get into the discussion. So with that, let me now introduce a friend, someone who I have known for quite some time and who I have always admired, Laney Brewer, who's the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at the Department of Justice. Now, the Criminal Division oversees a wide variety of enforcement areas, everything from narcotics and money laundering, child pornography, and fraud. And fraud is, as you can imagine, a very broad area that includes a number of topics relating to business conduct. And key among those issues in the fraud section is the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which the Department of Justice has enforced with great effort over the past 7 years or so. Well, as the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, Lenny Brewer oversees all of this enforcement activity, and he has a very important position in the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Enforcement environment. Lenny Brewer spent many years helping companies with compliance and defending them before the Department of Justice as he led the white-collar practice at Covington and Burling, which is a very significant U.S. law firm, as I'm sure many of you know. So he comes at this with a perspective of someone who has worked his entire career in Washington, affecting public policy, defending companies, and now as the chief person of enforcement for the Department of Justice criminal activity. So with that, let me turn it over to Lenny Brewer.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to be here and to speak to this group this morning. It's great to be here to meet new people. Paul, of course, has been a friend of mine for quite some time. Doug Lankler, to my right, has been as well. And it says something about all our lives that we have to come to St. Petersburg to see each other after many, many years. So it probably says something about how hard we all work, or I don't know what it says, but there you have it. There are a lot of people speaking today who are really expert on compliance. And as I told Paul and the panelists, I'm really willing to address any of the issues that we deal with in whatever level of specificity you want, and my preference is to make this iterative. So I think I'll try to be somewhat short initially, and if I've missed the mark on some of the points, I'm happy to address them later. I think thematically, I just want you all to know where we in the Department of Justice are coming from, why we do what we're doing. I've now been, as I said to Doug, the head of the Criminal Division for a little over 3 years. And as I say to anyone who cares to listen, it's the privilege of my professional career. It's been an extraordinary opportunity. And in whatever area that the division is involved in, I've tried for our team, and I'm very lucky to have a great team, to take really a thoughtful look as to what we're doing. When we're prosecuting organized crime, how is it that we're prosecuting organized crime? When we're prosecuting gangs or intellectual property crime, how is it that what we're doing, and why is it that we're doing it? Do we need a fresh approach? Do we need to have new prosecutors? What is the best way of dealing with it? And I feel that that's to some degree what we've tried to do with the issue of anti-corruption. I, of course, just play one role. We play the role dealing with the FCPA, as the Attorney General mentioned in his comments yesterday. We also began an anti-kleptocracy initiative. What's the anti-kleptocracy initiative? Well, the FCPA is to try to prevent people from bribing foreign officials. The anti-kleptocracy initiative is you're one of those foreign officials and you've made a lot of money and now you're going to spend your money in the United States. If we can prove it, if we can show that you have stolen money that really belongs to your citizens, then we ought to be able to try to recoup those monies. And so we'll bring a civil lawsuit in the United States. It's innovative, it's new, it's beginning, but it's sort of my paradigm of trying to have a comprehensive approach. And then, of course, the other way we deal with our anti-corruption efforts is through rule of law training. We have some of our extraordinary resident legal advisors in this room right now, and they've worked with other governments to try to explain why it is that the United States does what it does. And of course, more and more of the world community is coming along. But if you look thematically at what has gone on in the world, and you see over the last year, year and a half, we've seen in parts of the world citizens say, you know, we don't want our lives defined by corrupt leaders. The Arab Spring, in my mind, has occurred for a lot of reasons, and I don't pretend or claim to be some great political scientist. But when you take a step back and you look at the Arab Spring, and you look at what those young men and women were doing in parts of the Middle East and in North Africa, you see that what these people were essentially saying was, I want a future. I want to be defined by how hard I work, by an educational opportunity, by a chance to enhance my life in an honest and productive way, something that everyone on this panel wants and everyone on this panel wants for their children. And historically, in many parts of the world, that wasn't the case, because probably what defined your likelihood of success more than anything else was whether you were in a corrupt regime, whether you had a particular connection, whether you could pay somebody a certain amount of money, whether there was a way you could achieve something, not because of the quality of your product, not because of how hard you worked in school, but rather because of a quiet connection, or because somebody was willing to receive some money. In the Department of Justice, at the end of the day, we enforce the laws of the United States to better the United States, to make our citizens safer, to make the playing field flat and more even for businesses. And that's what we're trying to do in the international community, and we welcome those who join us in that effort, and more have. I was proud recently that at the Transparency International annual dinner, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton spoke. She was the keynote speaker. And in her comments talking about the world and talking about her world vision, where America stands and what America's values are, she spoke about the FCPA. She spoke about the fact that what the department was doing with respect to the FCPA was helping to bring American values, values that many of us share, about democracy, about equality of opportunity. And that is one very real way we can do it. It's not simply appealing to people's better instincts, which is something I very much believe in, but it's also enforcing people's better instincts by saying that if you do what you know in your heart is the right thing to do, you will improve. And if you do what in some societies has become all too common, or was too common, if you go to the baser side of instincts, if you try to cut a corner, if you try to bribe, I can't tell you you won't benefit. I can't tell you that there aren't parts of the world that you may get away with it. But what I can tell you is that if there's a U.S. nexus, and we're able to prove it, that we will deal with you severely. We will deal with you severely as a company, and over the last 3 years, I'd like to say we will hold individuals accountable. When I was confirmed in April of 2009, and I had my hearing a month earlier, senators said to me, aren't these big global settlements in all these different areas, FCPA and others, simply a price for doing business? And when are you all going to hold individuals accountable? And what I said 3+ years ago was it would be my goal that we would hold individuals accountable. Those who perpetuate violent crimes, we'd hold them accountable. People who perpetuate white-collar crimes, we would try to hold them accountable. I think Paul is right that more and more, and the people on this panel represented, there are more and more thoughtful people who are dealing in an important way with compliance, and there's been an enormous evolution. I'm old enough to remember that after being a prosecutor, when I represented companies, if you were smart enough to say to a prosecutor, I'm cooperating, we're cooperating with you, that in the beginning that almost got you halfway down the field, just those words. And there's no question that today we look for companies to be more sophisticated. We look to determine what you're doing it. And frankly, we want to encourage those of you who are acting in an appropriate manner. We want to encourage it. There's a big debate right now in the United States about our FCPA. There's some who think that we are prosecuting it too vigorously. There's some who have suggested that perhaps the law ought to be amended, that it ought to be watered down. And I've said, as I always do, that I love forum and I love to have an open discussion. But I think personally, and I know the Attorney General agrees, that at this moment in history, when you have the Arab Spring, when you have what Paul has referred to, the OECD, you have the anti-bribery law in England, you have a new anti-bribery law here in Russia. When you see sort of the way history is moving and you see the progress that's being made around the world, in my mind, this is precisely the wrong time to water down the FCPA. It's the right time to give more guidance. It's the right time to explain why we do what we do. You may not agree with it always, but we try to be more transparent. I've announced that we're having a guidance, which is almost unprecedented in the area of criminal law, for the Department of Justice to explain in further detail why it's doing what it's doing. But we're trying to do that. We're putting all our pleadings on a website. We have press releases. We continue to talk more and more. Recently, of course, we had, and many people are writing about it, and I'm sure it'll come up today, the Morgan Stanley matter. I shouldn't really call it the Morgan Stanley matter because we didn't hold Morgan Stanley responsible, but there was an individual at Morgan Stanley who was involved in violating the FCPA in China. We came to the conclusion in that case that you had a company with a robust compliance program, a company that had done great training, a company that had done great audits, a company that was doing the things that we have said we wanted to do, but yet they had a senior official who in a very calculating way tried nonetheless to be engaged in bribery and to steal money for himself and to try to fight the compliance that his company wanted. He was acting, and we concluded, a surreptitious way. And what did we do? I think we did what we've always said we will do. We held the individual responsible, and we gave the company a complete pass. What we want is the flexibility to deal with each case based on the facts of that case and the law of that case. We'll look at your compliance program. We'll look at your past conduct. We'll determine whether we think the compliance program is robust and dynamic in dealing with the needs. And based on that, we'll decide what we think is appropriate. It may benefit you that you'll get a complete pass and we won't prosecute at all. It may affect how we prosecute the case, whether you get a deferred prosecution agreement, a non-prosecution agreement, or whether we prosecute you. And if we do prosecute you and you have a compliance program, it may help you with respect to your culpability. How big is your fine? What is it that we think you need to do in the aftermath? So our goal is to be flexible. Our goal is to be transparent. Our goal is to encourage the world community to join with us, and much of the world community has, and it makes us better. And in doing that, ultimately, what do we think happens? We think American companies benefit because they play on an even playing field, because we hold American and foreign companies the same. We think it encourages good governance and good corporate citizenship and, frankly, just good business. And we think we have created enough of a world out there where people know we're serious about what we mean. We're fair, I'd like to think. We're willing to go to trial, and we'll go to trial. We'll take hard cases to trial. And in doing that, we in the Department of Justice feel we're one piece of a much broader piece to try to encourage good governance, to encourage good global citizenship, good global business. And with that, Paul, I'm delighted to be on your panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lanny, for those Eckert Wente, right to my left here. Thank you for your help. Eckert is Vice President, General Counsel, and Head of Compliance for Ford's joint venture here in Russia. And he has been with Ford for 13 years now and was previously European Director, and has been responsible for the implementation of a compliance program in this very historic joint venture that Ford has going on in this country. So we want to hear from Eckert and his experience in the area of compliance, particularly as it has played out in this environment in Russia. Eckert?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you. And let me express also that I'm delighted to be here today. It's a great opportunity for us to show how we as a company try to respond to what Lenny just said. Lenny, I think, outlined fully correctly what the expectations are, how important it is to have values and to incorporate them. And with my presentation here, I want to give you an example what a company has done in order to meet the expectations and to reduce risks as far as things is possible. So going to the next slide, or is it?
Here's a clicker for you. I just have one here.
Okay. So the first question, these are the areas of focus that I would like to take you through. The question, why have a compliance program? Then what we do and did to implement a compliance program in a 50-50 joint venture here in Russia. And then I would like to take you through the program itself and give you a little oversight how we are structured in this respect. So let me start with the question, why have a compliance program? First of all, we think that it is good for the business. You may ask, this is a lot of trouble that it brings, it is a lot of work, there are costs and expenses associated with having a compliance program. Is it really something you need? Yes, we think it is important to have that for several reasons. One, to have values is important for a company, and to put them down so that everyone in the company knows what the ethical conduct is that the company wants to adhere to and to act also in line with the laws and regulations, and that of course includes the anti-bribery aspect. But it can also be a way to success. We think that a public trust is important in the long run to be successful in the market. Think about customers and how they perceive brands, and they have several brands that they can choose from, and if you then have a brand that has a reputation that you don't really want, and would you really think that then customers are prepared to spend their money in that company? We think this is not the way that customers think. We think compliance and acting ethically and legally compliant is a way to success. Of course, most leading companies in the meantime do have a compliance program and are engaged in this, but probably all for the same reasons that I mentioned. But over it all, of course, there is also this aspect of compliance being required by law. For one, and Lenny mentioned that, companies and their persons, even the directors, can be held liable personally. High fines, even up to imprisonment, can wait if something goes wrong in this area. So from that perspective, it is very important. Then the courts consider compliance programs and the effectiveness, as we just heard, if something goes wrong. So again, it is something that you implement in order to prevent things from happening. I mean, no one will say nothing can happen, but you do your best as a company to prevent things from happening. And we see the laws as they evolve over time, and here Paul already gave you an overview of how the laws developed in the last few years with the FCPA, the US sentencing guidelines, and OECD, of course, was mentioned. The latest one is the UK Bribery Act, even having an implication here into Russia. So what have we done? Ford, as a 50% stakeholder in this joint venture that we formed here in Russia, has a long tradition with compliance. And we already in 1976, we had implemented our handbook on standards of corporate conduct, which has already strong provisions about anti-bribery. And Ford believed that these standards that we have are good ones and they should be promoted around the world. So the standards Ford has are global standards. And of course, what is then closer than if you form a joint venture in Russia, that you then also try to bring these values and the standards into the joint venture. Ford had already 10 years of an operation in Russia itself without a joint venture structure, and this Russian operation followed completely the Ford standards. But what we had to do is we had to agree with our joint venture partner that these standards that we think are global standards, are good standards, are incorporated. So what we did is we agreed in our joint venture agreement that the joint venture will follow in this regard the Ford policies and procedures. We then, as the joint venture itself, we had to adopt the standards, including the compliance program, what we did, and then we implemented it through binding orders, which all the employees had to sign. So let me now show you the house which we have, which summarizes our compliance program and how it is structured. What you see are basically 4 big pillars, and it has 3 pillars that are there in order to prevent ethical misconduct or illegal actions. And then we have on the far right-hand side 1 pillar which is meant for detection and response. I take you through these pillars one by one. The first one is our legal risk management that we have. We have a policy about this. What is it about? It is about an annual assessment or a process to review the legal risks the company faces. This is not only anti-bribery. There are many other areas where you can be at risk. We heard antitrust, data privacy, but also in the workforce area, anti-harassment issues. So this is a very broad assessment that the company undertakes and then reviews every year what are the high-risk areas, what should we focus on. And then on those aspects that have been identified as very high risk for the company, you then do a so-called in-depth analysis and report. And here you evaluate whether the compliance processes are effective that you have. You determine whether the resources you have allocated to mitigate the risks are appropriate. And then, of course, you also identify and try to identify areas for improvement, as you always can do something to improve. This is the overall compliance assessment within the company, and the results of that is then reported to the audit committee and to a certain extent even to the board. This is the second pillar, which is our Code of Conduct handbook, which the company has. This is what we use in order to promote a culture of compliance in the company. It is a comprehensive book which has about 60, 70 pages, and it addresses the high-risk areas in total that there are in general, and it gives an outline what our employees are supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do, and then it refers to the specific policies and directives that we have on the individual subjects. Then what we do is we remind our employees twice per year that we also have a reporting system to report anything that is either illegal or that is unethical. And I will come to that in a moment to give you some more outline how this is done. Then we, of course, also do train our employees. This is the third pillar in our house. It is about education and communication. It is for us important that our employees understand in what kind of environment they live, what the boundaries are. So what we have established are e-learning training modules which employees can access and are required to access. And then what they do is they learn within 30-40 minutes in e-learning tools what the requirements are, what to do. And of course we also do have one on the code of conduct. We have something about anti-bribery, data safeguarding, competition law. These are just a few to mention. In total, we have about 20 online trainings that are available in multiple languages. And there are some of them, about half of them, which are mandatory to all our employees. The other half is just for specified target groups that work in specific areas. And this one here shows you our fourth pillar, the reporting structure. In order to have the ability for employees to report that if they see a certain misconduct or an illegal behavior or the suspicion thereof, we provide to them several tools that they can use in order to report that. The company needs to know if something goes wrong in order to be able to act. And what we have done is we have established a hotline, which is here in Russia, which is responded, of course, also in Russian. If someone feels uncomfortable to report something here in the country, but rather wants to have the opportunity either to talk anonymously or to someone where they have more confidence that it is then properly handled, this person can also use the toll-free Ford corporate hotline in the United States that we have. There are electronic communication possibilities. Employees are encouraged, of course, also to report either to human resources, to our audit persons, and then the legal department. Me, as the Vice President, General Counsel and Compliance within the FORDSOLLERS team, I show on all the communications as well as a person that they immediately can contact for this. And then what we do have, we have local incident coordinators on the ground as well who are there in order to coordinate investigations and to follow up on matters that have been reported. They, of course, as well take reports as they come. This brings me to the end of my presentation with an overview of how we are structured, how we try to respond to the requirements that we see from a legal perspective, public prosecutor's perspective, and I'm now happy to give it back to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Eckert. Very interesting and helpful. It's interesting to note the variety of experiences that we have on the panel. We have a couple joint ventures, we have a U.S. company, we also have a state-owned Russian company, and that brings us to our third speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Victoria Nikiforova, who is Nikiforova is on Eckert's left, and Victoria is the head of anti-corruption at the Federal Grid Company of United Energy Systems, and will provide for us some thoughts about the perspective that her company brings to the compliance issue. Victoria.
Доброе утро, уважаемые дамы и господа. Мне очень приятно находиться.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here together with you in this event compliance. I'll tell you the example of our company, how we developed anti-corruption policy, how we came to the necessity of creation and compliance team. Our activity in this activity has begun in 2010 after having analyzed Russian law and trying to apply it to our company. We have started with developing an anti-corruption program for 2010-2011, and 2010-2011 we have developed the plans to implement this program. At the same time, we have created a committee on interest conflicts and we've created a department on implementation of anti-corruption policies. We have carried a number of events to prevent corruption and to create anti-corruption mindset with the employees. Applying Russian legislation in 2011, we have developed the order of expertise of the documents. There is a peculiarity of our company. We have 2 blocks, organizational documents, and we also have documents needed for purchasing deals. We have a lot of purchasing operations. We have divided in 2 blocks as well, competitive and non-competitive. I'll tell you in detail about purchasing activity, since it's more interesting and there is more corruption in it. We have started from non-competitive procedures. We divided into 3 steps of document verification at the planning of the deal stage, signing of the deal, and execution of the deal. We've checked at the signing on the we check the documents which necessitate this or that deal. So after indicating a corruption pattern, we didn't let it to grow to corruption itself. We limited it at the point of negotiation. We've made conclusions and we presented to the executor. We sent it to competitive committee in order to make a decision. So all manifestations of corruption have been eliminated, be it property deals with the increased market price of real estate and so on. The next block, which we are planning currently this year, is competitive procedures. Bidding, I understand that the Federal Law 93 is aimed at creating openness and competitive atmosphere. However, the practice showed the opposite. Therefore, we've tried to introduce anti-corruption control in this area as well. We have approached this issue by dividing it into 3 stages as well: preliminary control, current control, and follow-up. And at every stage we tried to regulate our actions and define the documents which we have to be involved at and which you have to check. Next thing is anti-corruption expertise of organizational documentation. It's easier because we have guidelines, we have adopted it to our company. So any documents we are developing, they are all agreed with our department. Therefore, we exclude the inclusion of things which might provoke corruption behavior of the employees. The next anti-corruption act is anti-corruption monitoring, which is done by our department. And after getting positive results of anti-corruption measures, we may develop it to other areas. In the company is very big. This is a stage-by-stage process. So first we do it with purchasing activity, organizational documents, acquisitions, or HR policy. Next thing we pay attention to is to create anti-corruption mindset. And in this area, we do inform the employees through our internal paper. We have a web portal where we describe a real life situation, where we describe the situation in such a way as to make corruption unattractive in the company. And it's in our plans this year is also to make socially oriented advertising to promote such behavior this year.
the result of this activity was the creation and development of a united consolidated document on anti-corruption policy, which defines the goals of our anti-corruption policy in the company. And in order not to present it as just our opinion, we created a hearing, a public hearing, and we listened to all remarks and suggestions, which we took into account when drafting the final draft. So during 2010 and 11, we implemented a corporate ethics code, certain procedures of working with insider information, and many other procedures. So speeding up this, we need to control the implementation and to see their compliance with instructions, laws, and so on. So finally, we decided that creation a compliance department covering all corporate procedures and anti-corrupting procedures would be a good idea. In general, I try to cover all the measures that we are covering in our company and our plans. And what we plan to do is to implement anti-corruption control in purchasing procedures. That is going to be our largest unit. And exchanging experience, taking all positive experience. I was talking mostly about Russian legislation, but we're also trying to make Russian legislation more compatible with global experience, like the procedures for giving gifts, charity, and all measures that can be beneficial. We're also trying to implement in the activity of our company. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all.
Thank you, Victoria. It's very interesting to hear how comprehensive and complete your company's compliance program is. Very, very interesting. So thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker to my immediate right is Paul Kitson, and Paul is the Director of Ethics and Risk Management and Compliance for TNK BP here in Russia. He's been in this position for over a year and a half, but has long time experience in Russia, I think 14 years or so, and has been previously, or over the course of his career, 20 years plus with BP. And so Paul has the opportunity to speak to us again from the perspective of a joint venture, but also long-time Russian experience. And so, Paul, I'm happy to hear from you now.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're a joint venture as well, 50-50 joint venture. And although I have access to all BP's materials, we're actually developing our own program. I mean, that's a sort of main difference with Eckhart, I think. We're developing our own program in the company. Now, you can have several similarities with what Eckhart has said. And I also start with, you know, why this is important. Could I have the... And I usually start with the sort of value proposition. You know, it's good for business, it's good for company values, good for company ratings. Which one do we do? Right. Here we go. And I've put the Russian slides up, but I'll speak in English. So, and I think we had a great example where this is really visible in the last few weeks. In April, the Department of Justice announced that they were going to investigate allegations of bribery in Walmart in their Mexico operations. The amount of the bribes suggested was 24 million, but what we saw was an instant drop in the market valuation of Walmart, about 5%, about $10 billion. So $24 million of bribes, $10 billion of market value. And in our company, you know, they're always interested, why is this important? And, you know, we start with that value proposition. And of course, for all our investors, not only equity investors, but lenders as well, it's important for them. And when you've got $7 billion of debt on your balance sheet, you know, you pay attention to their needs as well. I also feel that, you know, with international respected businessmen on your board, you've got a duty to protect their reputations. And of course, and what the regulators are interested in, it's fair competition. And that's good for us as well, because that gives us, you know, gives you access to best technology and access to best prices. I also found that the UK government guidance really helpful. It's guided a lot of our thinking. I also sort of follow the pattern of prevent, detect and respond, which we heard from Eckhart. And then lastly on this slide, I just want to emphasize the importance of tone at the top, especially in a Russian company. It gets huge, these managers have huge respect, huge authority, and to hear them, you know, saying the right things and doing the right things all the time, absolutely important, and that filters down through the company. Now, we also sort of get the question, well, who is responsible for, first of all, on the chart there is our document structure. So in the middle we've got our standard of business ethics, code of conduct, if you will. Then on the outer circle, it's all this subject matter of the standard and the procedures that back that up. So as you'd expect, we've got procedures that cover conflicts of interest, business gifts and entertainment, due diligence of business partners, new business transactions, you know, M&A activity, charity, insider trading, breach reporting, and which includes how we investigate and how we manage our relationships with governments. Then the next thing that's always have to emphasize is who's responsible for all of this. Now on here, this chart, I show 3 levels of responsibility, but the emphasis is that everybody is responsible. Everybody has their responsibilities. And for every individual in the company, everyone has got the responsibility to follow the code. They also have the responsibility to tell the company when they see something that's not right. When they've got good reason to see something that's not right, they have to tell us about it. We also want them to, if they see something not right, that they try and stop it at the time. But we understand that's not always possible, and especially if they feel that there's some threat to their personal selves. And of course, the top level, senior management, they're responsible to provide the resources, make the resources available for this, to manage the communication in the company, manage the public image of the company in this respect, and to, of course, generally lead by example. Now, the problem area is those in the middle, those that supervise others. They tend to be those that are under the most pressure to perform, to reach targets, and of course, have the biggest temptation to take shortcuts. For them, we require them to, you know, ensure their subordinates are trained, receive the training according to our programs, that all the control procedures are followed, that they create an atmosphere of openness such that ethical issues can be discussed in groups openly, and that when somebody does make a report, that there's no discrimination, there's no recrimination against that person. And of course, you can imagine the situation. An employee goes to his boss, I'm having trouble completing this task. The boss responds, Can't you see I'm busy? Just get it done. I don't care how you do it. And of course, that is an invitation to go and break the rules. And I want to talk about some of the sort of over and above the procedures, some of the other activity that we're doing in the company. First one is company values. When it comes to performance management on an individual level, we assess performance on 4 areas. That is safety, leadership, performance, and integrity, which includes ethical behavior. So everybody, and they all get equal weighting. Everybody, has their salary and their performance bonus based on these elements. So ethical behavior is an integral part of that. Next one I want to mention is we have a network of ethical experts. So every business unit has a designated person. Every unit and every corporate center function is a designated person, an ethics expert. And what they do is, first of all, they are not responsible for the ethical behavior of their unit. The responsibility lies with the leadership, of course. But what they do is, they're the first point of call for advice. They will assess the training needs of their unit over and above the basic training that we provide through online training. And we can arrange face-to-face training for specific needs. And they'll ensure that, all the communication and training that goes through the company, it reaches the intended target. They support us in coordinating conflicts of interest declarations and the certification of ethical behavior, which we do on an annual basis. Recently, we got them all together and we had a day together. We've got about 50 of these ethics experts in the group, and so we spent some time as a workshop going through various conflict of interest scenarios, just to ensure that we're getting consistency of application when it comes to resolving conflicts of interest. And as a side on conflicts of interest, we'll always try to manage them in the company. It's very rare that we'd actually expect somebody to leave the company. On the sort of contracting side, we have regional contracting councils, and there we have in each region meeting with our contractors, suppliers. It gives us a chance to express to them, our contracting plans, our expectations of them, including our ethical compliance expectations of them. They feed back to us their experience of tendering with us, and that helps us improve our process. On the communication side, what we find very effective is we have a hierarchy of town hall meetings. So the top 100 executives gather together once a quarter, and then they filter down town halls for their business units and their functions. We find this a very effective communication method. Once again, it's the message coming from the very top managers of the company, and messages about compliance. And at each meeting, we have a different theme that gets filtered down. And we have a system of written communication. We call it direct dialogue, and it's a written communication which leaders can use in their business units to share information with their teams. Other communications, well, we have articles in company newspapers, magazines, formal information notes which get put on our internal website that everybody gets to see. They get their own email alerting them to a new communication. And e-learning, which we're using more and more for basic training, and then enhancing that with face-to-face training on an as-needs basis. We've established what we call an integrity commission. Now, you'll hear everybody say their approach to bribery corruption is zero tolerance. What does that mean? The way I look at this is, for zero tolerance to be absolutely effective, you must have consistent approach to discipline.
and you need to make sure that everybody gets to hear about it. You can imagine the situation. You have your star performer breaks the rules. Because he's a star performer, you don't take any action. That's the wrong approach. We must have a consistent approach for this. And so what we've done, we've established an integrity commission. It consists of senior managers in the group, and they consider the important cases of misconduct. And it's an advisory group, and we make sure that the discipline is consistently applied and there's an appropriate message goes out to the group so people will understand what has happened. And of course there's technological aids to disclosure. It's very easy now to establish a system that can link approval of gifts and entertainment, so you can do that all automatically. You can get it done before the event takes place. Establishing gifts and entertainment registers, conflicts registers, and conflicts reporting and certification. All of that is done electronically now. Then on reports and investigations, everyone knows how to report. There's the hotline, there's an email account, guarantee of confidentiality, anonymity if they want it, and everyone receives a response, and we have specialist investigators that carry out the investigations. So Paul, that was all I wanted to share with the group today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And I think it's particularly interesting and perhaps a good subject for us to talk about at the end on the issue of how you set up your own compliance program locally while still dealing with perhaps the global program that the company maintains. That's a fascinating question. But we have to move on with our initial presentation, so it's my pleasure now to look at another company that has a strong reputation in the area of compliance and is operating here in Russia, General Electric Corporation. And Inga Saltykova is with us, and Inga is the Chief Compliance Officer for Russia General Electric Corporation, and will share with us some of the challenges that she and her colleagues face in doing business in Russia. Inga.
Доброе утро. Всем доброе утро.
Good morning, everyone.
Maybe it's easier for compliance issues, I don't know. So first of all, I'm delighted to be here, really to be with this panel, to be with this audience, to discuss all these topics, and to speak a bit about my company that I'm really proud to belong to. I'm not alone with the company, but it's really, I has been impressed, and I'm still impressed. I am sure I will remain impressed all the way along with the company. So it is General Electric. My focus will be Russian business of the company, and the challenges that we face here in the region, and how we cope with these challenges, how we face these challenges. But I couldn't resist temptation to say a few words about the company, which is a really great company. I'll try to be fast. I know that we have time constraints, but still, I'll try to. It works. So, as you probably everybody knows, so the company was established by famous Thomas Edison, and it happened in 19th century, so it was long, long ago. And it's famous gentleman, and the company still remains, so we can count how many years it was long ago, but still the company remains, that it was at the very beginning, it remains to be a great company. So, and just a few words, what's General Electric today? So there is, I have it probably here for me to easier to look at my slides, sorry. It doesn't work now. Okay, so we have businesses. We have a few businesses like energy, including oil and gas. We have healthcare, aviation, transportation, capital, and home and business solutions. That's quite a diversified company. It's around 150 billion in revenue. So around 300,000 employees worldwide. Operations, so it's really global company. Operations are in 150 locations globally. And it is the only company that was in the initial Dow Jones Industrial Average Index, which is still in this index. It's the only one. Okay, it works now. So get into compliance, closer to compliance. So the company is really famous and acknowledged for compliance program, global compliance program. So General Electric received the highest rating from government metrics. You know about Ethisphere lists, and from the very beginning in 2007, and every year since that, and this year as well, General Electric is named as one of the world's most ethical companies, according to this list. Now a bit about Russia. So it's quite surprisingly, but General Electric has a history, quite a long history in Russia. And it started in the 20s of the last century. And General Electric participated in the famous Gail-Ro project. It is modernization of energy infrastructure in the country. The first rep office was opened in 1974. Then the business developed, and most of GE businesses right now are present in the region. And last year, we signed 2 joint ventures with the Russian partners, and so we right now are localizing our operations in the region, and the plans are to have local manufacturing here. Getting back to compliance, but this is still, they have a couple of slides for global compliance. I will not dwell on them because probably if you attended other presentations, other conference, so it's a lot of good words that could be said about global compliance program of General Electric. We really do a lot. It seems that we do everything which is possible. We have all probably that could be mentioned and that have been mentioned by my colleagues today. So I'll skip this. This is what the only comment I have here, that we have business structure in the company and we have regional structure in the company. And both structures, they have their compliance resources. Overall, we have around 500 compliance leaders in the company. And so there is some allocation of responsibilities between business and regional structure, and there is a lot of collaboration. But again, it's not the focus of my presentation. Let's get back to Russia. So at one point of time, it was the year 2000, the company decided that Russia is a very interesting region. It's really, we would like to develop here. But at the same time, we see some risks, some special risks. Whether it's right or wrong, but it's really the perception, it's global perception, it's company perception, that there are some special risks, very specific to the region. And the risks were named as corruption, level of corruption. It's, yeah, we know Transparency International Index. Again, right or wrong, but this is perception. We need to cope with perception as well. And perception is a form of reality. That's also right. Then possible tax evasion in the region, strict currency controls, and schemes to avoid this currency control. And then high customs duties and also schemes to avoid high customs duties. So all this was discussed in the company. It was more than 10 years ago. And the company made the decision. On the top of all great compliance program that we had that time and we developed and we are developing all the time, to have something more, to add one more layer to this, to add one more level of control. And that time the company made a decision to add so-called CIS guidelines, or guidelines for doing business in Russia and CIS countries. So it's additional. It goes on the top. So after all the controls that we had within business, within the region, to do one more control. And here I have an analogy with airport, and aviation is one of the GE's businesses. So to get to the plane, we need to go through certain levels of control. And dependent on the risk associated with this or that flight, it could be less control or more control. So the decision was made, let's do it the probably over-engineering of it, but to be on the safe side, to add this control to it. So this CIS guidelines was added. And what's it about? So this, in addition to the all checkup of third parties, business know your customer process, watch lists, etc., etc. So we the company added analysis of deal structure, of all elements of deal structure, with the focus on the areas that I mentioned, like tax evasion, money laundering, certain trade control issues, and reputational damage, and also other areas. By the way, if you see this entry scan, a General Electric scan, it's General Electric scan. So what is subject of review of every transaction that associated with the business in Russia and CIS? So we perform due diligence of each party involved. Then there is analysis of business rationale of the deal structure. So business need to explain, to provide rationale for using this or that intermediary, for using this or that bank, etc., etc. We may ask questions. We may double check this. And talking about banks, for the region, we have a list of approved banks. I'm sure we're the only one region who has this list. And we check up the transaction and all the bank payments that will be done during this transaction versus this list. So there could be exceptions, but these exceptions should be granted by compliance department. Then there is analysis of shipment route, because ownership structure, changes of ownership within the transaction may go one way. Goods may go other way. Payments may go the third way. So we make analysis of all these to make a decision, whether we can go forward or not. And the information sources that we use for this, it is independent investigative agencies, third parties agencies, that provide screening, so-called screening of third parties. If needed, we may ask for so-called deep screening, go deeper in this. Then internet search, especially Russian sources of internet search that we haven't got from business, for example, because business might do the internet search but in English language based. And then there could be some other justifications or confirmation, including letters from clients and third parties, etc., etc. So all these is added to the normal due diligence. And then we'll see, will this person pass or not? Do we think that it's good to have this person on our plane or not? We are looking for red flags. And system of red flags addresses risk, the same risks that I have mentioned. And what we look at, what is the gun point? It's quite normal for due diligence, like shell companies, opaque ownership structure, potential conflict of interest, reputational risks, etc., etc. Banks, as I mentioned, with a special that we'll look at, and then payment, etc. structure. So I think I covered this. Currently, we have 32 red flags that we operate within the region, but it's really a work in process. We may change this list. We're developing it all the time. Dependent, we take it from our experience and we make this list better. And the result of this review, in the result, there are two options. It's either stop and transaction is prohibited and we cannot go forward with this transaction, or it's a green light and transaction is allowed. And then after this, we can say, have a safe flight, and we can we can join this flight. We feel pretty much safe being on this plane. So that's what we do and how we address it and how we try to have our compliance program good for agencies. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga. We haven't heard from Doug or Adam yet, but I'm prepared to say that you win the award for most colorful slides. So, Doug, the pressure is on, but I really enjoy the analogy to air travel. And for many companies, I think their third-party program is a little bit like air travel in the 1950s or something like that. So, very interesting. Next, we will turn to Doug Lankler. Doug is someone who is extremely busy as the Executive Vice President and Chief Compliance and Risk Officer for the world's largest pharmaceutical company, Pfizer. And I'm a friend of Doug's, and it's hard to come in contact with compliance conferences and not run into Doug, because he is called upon frequently to describe his life and what he does with Pfizer. He's a former federal prosecutor who probably looks back longingly at those days and wishes that his life was a little easier. But he's a real expert in this area and has served to help a lot of people in the compliance business understand what the challenges are and how to meet those challenges. So, Doug, if you would offer your perspective, please.
So I'll warn you that my slides are not nearly as good as my colleagues from General Electric. But in my defense, she's got cool things like plane engines, and if I gave you an analogy with Viagra or something like that, it probably wouldn't go quite as well. So they are much drier, and I apologize.
Or at least at 10 in the morning.
Yes, at 10. It's not the right time. We'll get together later. We've heard really great things about programs from my fellow panelists. I'm thrilled to be here. And it really is a great opportunity for Pfizer to be able to participate in panels like this, because we learn a lot, and it's just a very important thing for us. I'm going to skip my 2 slides on our program, because you've heard an awful lot about programs, and suffice it to say, we've spent a lot of time developing our program. While we're proud of our program, I will tell you candidly, and I'll try to give you as much candor as I can today, we're still fixing it. We're still constantly changing it, because it's really hard. It's really hard to get right. It's really hard to make sure that it works well in the business context. It's genuinely difficult to make sure all around the world we are meeting the very appropriate expectations that Lanny laid out in the beginning of this panel. There are challenges. Things are still changing in the world. Things are still changing in business. And while I'm happy to say that, at least from my perspective, it's all getting better over time, we still have a ways to go. I think as industry, as business, and as world cultures are changing, we're not certainly at the point of perfection by any means, and it's still a very interesting process. So as I promised, I'm going to skip my first 2 slides. This was a slide on our core policies and procedures. no cool graphics, no, planes, so I'm gonna get to the, hopefully slightly more interesting stuff. Can you skip me to the, and just skip me one more slide if you don't mind. Thank you. So here are our key learnings. And the first thing I will tell you is kind of just reiterating what I just said, which is that this is hard. Anybody who stands up and tells you, we've got it all figured out, it's all good, is either doing it much better than we are, which could be possible certainly, or has certainly figured out something that we haven't figured out. As is expected, society and the governments that operate in the jurisdictions in which we do business should expect us to be able to run our businesses without engaging in bribery. That is just a simple, basic core concept. And at least what I find as we go around the world and we interact with our colleagues is that's what they want. They genuinely want to work for a company that does it right and does it the right way. And some of the points made before about culture and values and tone at the top are just absolutely the most important, I think, of the whole discussion. To have business leaders say, I want you to walk away from business if it in any way compromises our values is just critically important. And they have to obviously mean that when they say it. They have to be able to say, I understand that we walked away from a highly profitable opportunity, and I understand that we may not make our revenue budget goals because we had to walk away from that situation. And I'm okay with that. Is really, really important. And it's very important that that be one of the things that senior leaders repeat over and over and over again to colleagues, because if employees don't genuinely believe that that's what the senior leader wants, it won't work. They'll think it's just, come on guys, do it the way everybody's expecting us to, but let's meet the numbers. That can't happen. That commitment is really important because these processes and these systems are brutal. They're very expensive. They're very time-consuming to put in place. It takes a long time to get them to the point where they will actually work and help you discover the risks and problems that you're trying to prevent in the first place. We have gone through a lot of different iterations of our systems. I have found that our individual offices, their favorite thing to do is that when I land in a location, they send the person who's been most bothered and troubled and whose life has been made most difficult by our FCPA procedures to pick me up at the airport and then to drive me back the 2 hours to the office so I can hear just how difficult it is. So it's a phenomenally valuable conversation. I've heard it a few too many times. I'd like to move on from it. But the reality is, in a space where we've been working so hard all the time, we still have a ways to go, and it's still really challenging. We talked about kind of how hard it is. Not surprisingly, country-specific cultures and norms aren't always in touch. That doesn't mean that a culture specifically has the norm that they're going to do bad things, but it might take a while to convince colleagues in a different culture that we have different norms and expectations, and beyond just getting it right, we got to make sure it looks right as well, and that's just critically important. So educating your colleagues on the actual reason why you're doing this cannot be overstated. So many of the things that Lanny said, I think, are critical to this part. Pfizer had all kinds of problems. Hopefully we don't still have all kinds of problems. But certainly in the early 2000s, as we were going around and looking at things, we were finding conduct that we didn't like. I would offer, you won't be surprised to hear me say this, particularly as I'm sitting so close to Lanny right now, to you that as a company that has gone through a number of negotiations over a fair period of time with Lanny's office and with the United States Department of Justice, I can assure you that what he says is true. The Department of Justice does take these things very, very seriously. They will treat you severely. Fortunately, we've been treated very fairly, but appropriately sternly by the United States Department of Justice as we talked about problems that we were discovering. They gave us an opportunity to fix those problems. They gave us an opportunity to investigate those problems. And as long as we were able to show that we did it in a very thorough manner and that we were taking it seriously and that we were remediating it, they gave us the opportunity to do that. So that's, as a company, something we greatly appreciate, and that's not something you automatically get. Not every government, not every set of prosecutors is going to necessarily do that. But to have the ability to do that is really important. The only way I think Pfizer is going to maintain the license to operate with the government in that way is if we can continue to show that we're taking our problems seriously and that we're actually fixing our problems. We also have to show that we have fewer and fewer and fewer problems. And knock on wood, so far that's what's been happening. We've got to maintain that. Maintaining is the last point that I would just really offer is so critical. You heard my other colleagues on the panel talk about this. You've got to repeatedly talk about this. You have to repeatedly remind people that you're still taking this seriously and that you always will. In our experience, the problems still come up. They get smaller and smaller. They get less systemic, which is all very, very good. But we've got to get to a point where the distance between where we are and where we want to be gets closed out. We feel like we're on that journey and we feel like we're on that path. It is one that I would just leave you with this last thought. It requires a genuine commitment by the organization to do it in all ways, to know that it's going to be difficult, that it's going to be expensive, that it's going to be hard, and that they're going to persevere through it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the very personal and kind of on-the-ground feel of your comments and a number of great issues you've raised, and hopefully we'll have a chance to follow up with you on some of those. Finally, we have an opportunity to hear from someone who is in touch with compliance people, chief compliance officers, others who work in the compliance area on a daily basis, and so has some insights that come from the widest range of companies and their compliance challenges. Adam Turteltaub is the Vice President of Membership for the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. I happen to be a member of the society, I'm proud to say. And they have a very large organization, conferences. I'm not sure if you have, are they international? I know they're certainly international.
We actually have events now in China, Europe, and South America.
Okay. Well, they certainly have a lot of events in the course of the calendar year in the U.S. I see that regularly, including a major conference every year for the in North America. So, Adam, if you'd offer your insights, and then we can have some questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for having me. You know, to Paul's point, compliance has grown hugely globally. We have 2,800 members. Most are in the U.S., but at this point we have membership in 50 countries around the world. And this has been my third trip to Russia in the last 7 months, which I think really speaks to how much growth there is. And given that I live in Los Angeles, it's not a short trip each time. I'll be getting home a day after I think everybody else does because of that. What's interesting is we do programs around the world is there's been a tremendous amount of convergence. And I think as we listen to these panels, and Paul asked me to put something of a summary together, I'll be touching on this. There's a lot of themes that go on throughout all of this. And one of that is really that as you look at compliance, it's no longer just a U.S. thing. There was talked earlier about the OECD's good practice guidance, what's happened at the Bribery Act. And what you look at is both two things. One, the fact that more and more governments are asking for compliance, but also that they're saying the same things, which is a great thing for business. That basically what they're looking for you to do is understand the risks you face, train people to deal with them, audit to make sure you're following the rules, monitor discipline and reward people for doing the right thing and discipline those for doing the wrong thing. And then when you have a problem, try and remediate it so that, to what Doug had said, you don't repeat the problems and your problems get less and less over time, more and more. What it's all about really is having a system of controls in place for your organization, and there's tremendous value in having those kinds of things. And it's a great way to both build your business and also build it in the right way. Lanny, I think, made some really good points here about thinking broadly. It's not just about FCPA. FCPA and anti-corruption legislation has driven compliance elsewhere, but the same structures that you put in place to control for that risk can provide you with real benefits for all of the other risks you face, whether it's antitrust, protecting intellectual property, export controls, no matter what your business is. Those same kind of structures that you put in place for anti-corruption can be ported over into those things as well. The other thing is look also to learn from what governments tell you. The DOJ has been great in embracing openness. Everything from its advisory opinions for people who write in asking questions about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to the Morgan Stanley case, which you referred to earlier. I think what's really terrific about that is it gives management a great example of the fact that compliance programs can actually save your company money. As companies invest very heavily in this area, there is always that question about what's the real payoff, because frankly, if a compliance programs work, nothing happens. And how do you measure the value of nothing happens? Well, the Morgan Stanley case was a great way for people to see, or the Morgan Stanley, I think, non-case, as you put it, of what actually can be done. When Eckert was talking, a couple of things struck me. One is something that Paul later echoed, is Ford stuck by its standards globally when it came here. And I think it's a very important thing to remember. I spent 13 years in advertising agencies, and one of the things you learn when you work in advertising is the value most companies have, the greatest asset they have is their brand. It's what their value is. It's why people will pay more for one good or service than they will for another. Years ago, I worked on sinus remedies, which anybody has sinus headaches. What's interesting is everyone has their favorite brand. What no one does is turn the box over and look at the ingredients. And Doug, I think you can vouch for the fact that every sinus remedy, at least in America, is exactly the same. There's no difference at all between them, except the brand name on the front of the box. And that's why people swear by it. The brand is
Except
really...
that all of Pfizer's are much better than
better,
the
right.
other ones.
Especially the ones that have Viagra in them, right? Exactly.
We haven't quite gotten into that space. But
okay, great. And it's very important to always remember that, and also to encourage people to speak up. One of the things that's been a constant theme throughout all of these presentations is the importance of the need for communication. And it's important to remember that that's two ways. On the one hand, you've got to talk to your employees, help them understand what management's expectations are, and at the same time you have to demonstrate the willingness for people to listen to them. The importance of the hotline is really multiple. One, it is you want to be able to find that thing that's gone wrong. But you also want people to know that someone will listen. And it's one of the things that we hear over and over again from our membership is even the stupid calls that come in there and all the other issues that make it to the compliance department through the hotline or just filtered up through management have to be responded to, because it sends the message to the employees that the company is listening, but also it lets them know that if they see something really big, that they can feel safe in coming forward to it. One of the things as I was listening to Natalia speak is interesting to hear that even state-owned enterprises are starting to think the same way, that it's also about creating an environment where people understand that the rules apply to everyone. It doesn't matter what kind of an institution you work for. And that's very important. I mean, one of the issues that a lot of organizations face is complacency, the feeling that it's never happened here, we're somehow removed from these issues. And if you can overcome that feeling, you can help people move forward in a much better way. Also, as you communicate with them, as you try and get that, there was a great issue you raised, Paul, about focusing on the middle. There's a lot of attention paid to tone at the top. And the reality is the CEO is a very distant figure for most people. Their manager is the most important person that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And what he or she is or isn't doing says volumes. You know, people notice the fact that their boss takes an hour lunch or a 3-hour lunch, and that sets the tone. It doesn't matter that nobody knows if the CEO never leaves his desk for lunch and meets straight through. If your manager is doing something wrong, that's what's important. You also, I thought, raised a really good point, and I hope I'm not overextending it, but compliance is not the responsibility of the compliance department. It's the responsibility of the business units. You as a compliance professional are not, it's not your job to make sure every single person follows the rules. The business units have to own that. The compliance role's job is to ensure that there's structures in place that make that happen, because there's only so many of all of you. You can't be everywhere at all time. It has to extend all the way into the units. Also, you may have to make sure, because of that, as Inga pointed out, that you align your compliance programs with your business and how it works, and understand that the standards and practices have to fit both what the business unit does and the region that they're in, and including understanding what the red flags are. And one of the key things is where sometimes companies fall short, they know what the red flags are, but they're not prepared to act on them. I think one of the things I've heard from over and over from people is the worst thing you can do is walk into your office and say you've got a policy. The best thing you can do is say you've got a procedure to go with the policy. And that's a huge difference to be there, to be aware of. And Doug, I think, closed with some really good points about the fact that it keeps changing. You know, what's funny about business is nobody expects your profits to stay the same. Profits are always expected to increase. What they forget is the compliance standards should probably be increasing at the same time. It's one of the few areas where business would like to think that they're done and don't have to do it. And the reality is social expectations keep changing. This anti-corruption conversation we're having now wouldn't have been had 10 or 15 years ago. Likewise, areas of social responsibility like environmental green issues, carbon dioxide footprints, those kinds of things keep happening. And if you look back at what was acceptable in business 40, 50 years ago versus today, those expectations keep rising, and business needs to be aware of all of those things. And the other thing, there was one topic that just didn't come up, which I thought we should mention, is the issue of third parties. When it comes to compliance, is the realization that the fact that the way the laws are written, your responsibility doesn't end at the gates of your factory or your offices, that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, enforcement doesn't really care if it was your third-party agent or contractor who paid the bribe or you did. It's your responsibility. So too with the Bribery Act, and it's important that people do that. And actually, I have, if anyone's interested, some brochures on managing third parties, as well as the OECD good practice, what the OECD's been saying. And finally, I think one of the things that came really through in all of this is the fact that integrity isn't easy, but that's one of the reasons why it's worth striving for. And I think what we look at when we look at what makes for successful compliance programs is they're ensuring the integrity of the business, both in the moral sense and in the actual practical sense of the business. A compliance failure can undo companies. They can cost them billions of dollars in market value, and most importantly, they can cause enormous distractions to the business. And if there's a failure there, it's very expensive, both in terms of dollars and time and reputation, and ultimately it's a bit of tarnish on that brand that's so valuable to companies. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Those are very helpful summation comments. We want to now turn to your questions, and to start this process, I'd like to ask Lanny a question, and then hear from you all if you have comments or questions. We wouldn't want Lanny to get away from a international law conference without getting some of his thoughts on international cooperation. And particularly with regard to the FCPA, which has such a long arm and can hold companies around the world accountable. Even companies that aren't foreign issuers can find themselves subject to an FCPA. enforcement action because of the laws of conspiracy and aiding and abetting, and we've seen a lot of interesting cases. But Lanny, I'd like to get your thoughts on how you've seen international cooperation, sharing of information, working cases, and so forth change even over your 3.5 years of experience, and where you see that going, and how companies should be thinking about the challenges of both defending themselves in a place like Russia, which now has a new anti-corruption law and will be probably looking to enforce that law more energetically in the future, and at the same time dealing with U.S. authorities.
Well, Paul, what I see is that it's improving, the world is getting smaller, and our level of cooperation with more and more partners is far more dynamic, far more collaborative, and candidly, from the government's perspective, far more effective. So when there was a time when we were relying on a very onerous MLAT process, or other very formalistic ways of exchanging information with most countries, now our best partners, it's a far more police to police, it's far more of a collegial, and candidly, it's far more of a streamlined process. As we've been very vocal about what we're doing in the area of FCPA, but as I've said and as Adam alluded to, I don't just look at it as an FCPA phenomenon. I look at it as a phenomenon in the cyberspace, in fighting botnets, and fighting organized crime, and fighting cyber and child exploitation. Those who break the law often don't know national boundaries. In the world we're in today, to be effective as a deterrent and to be effective in enforcing and bringing cases against those who violate the law, we absolutely have to be an international player, and we need the collaboration of our friends, which is like the same way that Doug is on panels. The amount of international travel that I've had over the 3 years, candidly, probably surprises me, and this is my second time just in Russia. Our relationships are strong in many countries, and in some countries, candidly, where it's less strong, we've been able to identify those within those structures with whom we can do the most work, and so that's good, and it's also good because we ought to be in a place where the United States isn't always bringing the cases, where our friends are bringing the cases, and they're as committed as we. And so the world is changing. It's changed over the last 3 years. It's certainly changed over the last 10. I suspect this phenomenon will continue very much.
That's very interesting. I know in my experience at the Department of Justice, right after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, I watched that as we were dealing with the essential international cooperation associated with the dealing with terrorism, that those relationships began to expand, and that there was an increasing willingness to work together to address that vital concern and then look at other concerns that would come up at the same time. And I watched that change during the 7 years I was at DOJ very significantly, and I just assumed that Attorney General Holder and you and others have watched that even grow more since then. I'd invite you now to ask your questions and make your comments. Tom?
Thank you. I have a question for Paul, Lanny, and Doug, as all criminal lawyers, especially U.S. criminal lawyers who specialize in the FCPA. One issue that I think is very interesting in enforcement of the FCPA overseas is the line between extortion and bribery, which is not always clear. It's not always clear where one ends and the other begins. I think this can be especially true in the former Soviet Union and Russia. Here there have recently been some cases in which government officials, investigators, law enforcement officials have have been prosecuted for extortion, for taking money from business people not to criminally prosecute them. And as I said, those are prosecuted by extortions, but as extortion, one might also see it as bribery. And there are a lot of situations here, and talk to people who do business in Russia, in which they complain about official harassment by various authorities. They threaten them with, to shut down their businesses, to start criminal cases against them if they don't pay. The FCPA is pretty clear that the only way you can have a defense of extortion is if it's true duress, a threat of physical harm to blow up your business or to kill you. And that simply the line that, well, we have to pay because you can't do business in this country without paying bribes is not a viable defense for obvious reasons. But what about that gray area in between where it's really, if you don't pay, maybe you're not going to be killed, but your business is going to be shut down, or you're going to be locked up for some period of time in prison. Do you think that there needs to be an expansion of that kind of defense under the FCPA for countries in which corruption is a pervasive problem?
Great question. Lanny, Doug?
Sure. First question I have is, how come the guy who works for me didn't tell me ahead of time he was going to ask that question? So look, what I would say to you is that in my 3.5 years, obviously I've heard repeatedly from different business communities, associations, and the like, that there are just parts of the world that it's almost impossible to do business without bribing. And we've heard that. I've got tremendous co-panelists here who've identified it, and you're absolutely right. That with respect to that, Tom, that's not a defense. I have not heard, not once, have I heard someone come in and say, the reason we did this bribe was because they were going to blow up our factory. As you know, in another world, I spent a lot of time also dealing with Mexico and the challenges of the cartels, and we've done a lot in trying to fight that problem. And in that world, I do hear that. I hear in contexts where law enforcement people or other talk about the most elemental fear one can have of the safety of themselves and their family. So I haven't approached that. I would probably be skeptical in this context. And my view is the last time I was here, as you know, you took me there, what really made an impression on me was one of your predecessors organized a group of Western companies that are doing business in Russia. And they were sort of self-policing themselves to some degree and sort of had come up with their own norms of how they were going to deal with the issue of corruption, and felt that their greatest strength was that they could be part of this group together. And frankly, their message to me was, we want you to be stronger, not less strong, more vigilant, not less vigilant, because the only way that we can resist sometimes giving into bribery is because we're told that if we do it, we will run afoul of the FCPA and other rules. So I guess what I would say is, I always say every case is based on the facts and the law, and I never say never, and I'm extraordinarily proud of the team we've created, and we try to be responsive, and so I'd never say never, but it would be a very high bar for me to ever be convinced of that. I'd say get out of the business. I wouldn't say, and as you know, and then I'll stop, duress is a very, very high legal standard in a court, and I guess I would expect my team to hold that high standard.
Doug, thank you, Lanny. You want to add anything to that?
In 2006, the Pfizer Russia business actually stopped doing business amongst our most important channel, because what we determined was we were having problems. We couldn't pursue things without facing the types of challenges that you just described, and we just made a decision that we were going to forego a significant amount of revenue and other things because we weren't able to yet prevent the problems that we were seeing. We had to fix the controls, and we're literally in one of these critical channels just now starting to get back into that space. I would offer that at least in our experience, the conversations that we had with the Department of Justice have kind of supported what Lanny just said. It is dependent on the facts, right? So I felt like we could come in and we could say, we're having this problem, and it's genuinely just really difficult. I know that that's not the first time, his staff has heard that. But at least in my experience, there's an appreciation for that notion, and that's kind of incorporated into these are the issues we've had. This is what we're trying to do to deal with it. We want to get back into this space as quickly as we possibly can, not just because it's important to our company from a revenue standpoint, but it may be important to patients and physicians to get certain types of medications back. So I think the answer is in kind of what Lanny's talking about, is how he and his team hear that information and how they work with not just American businesses, but other businesses in terms of how they're going to manage. But I do think it requires that willingness to say, okay, we're stopping. Sorry, if the only way we can get this product off the dock is by constantly paying you guys, we're not taking the product off the dock, and we're not going to bring the product to the dock anymore. And we'll go and we'll meet with your officials and we'll explain we cannot do it. We have to stop. It's the only way it's going to move anything forward. And then the explanation back home, what's happening and what we're trying to do with it. Rest assured, businesses are not happy about this. They don't like that. And one of the things they want from the U.S. government, which I think is also happening, is help us. We need to go into some of these local jurisdictions, and explain we want to do business here. This can't continue. It's not 1974 anymore or what have you, and certainly not easy. I think your point is a really good one.
That you put your finger on a great issue as well in terms of the realities of due diligence and third parties. But before we go there, I want to see if anyone else has another question or comment.
Спасибо, уважаемые коллеги. Денис Никиенко.
Thank you. Denis Gienka, I'm the director of legal department of oil chemical company, Sibur. Please let me say just one thing regarding the question from the audience. If in one jurisdiction a bribe is being extorted from you, you need to go to law enforcement. If you think that there is no law enforcement in the country, don't do business in the country. As regards my question, Lenny, it's probably for you, because you touched on the subject of making decisions regarding the responsibility of companies which was accused of certain illegal activity. Do you think that, on the whole, this system of compliance in the world, globally, is developing along some kind of socialist lines, more regulation for private companies and more power of state officials, and for the business it creates certain unnatural hurdles? Business has to create rather cumbersome structures within itself to be protected against state institutions coming to the corporation saying you don't have the system in place and you have to respond for that. Do you think we're going away from liberal economics to socialist rule where the role of state and of state officials is very important?
I actually think it's the exact opposite. I think the whole premise of enforcement of the FCPA and other laws like that is to even the playing field. To have companies around the world succeed by the quality of their products, by the competitiveness of their prices, and to be rewarded for their hard work. It's not because of an all-powerful government that selects one entity to get all the resources. It's not because of an all-powerful government where certain officials receive under-the-table payments or have accrue power that their citizens don't know. It's for transparency to be paramount. And in my mind, that's the hallmark of democracy. there are no hidden agendas, that we understand how things are, we understand what the rules are, and that in the marketplace, those who have the best products survive and flourish, and those who rely upon what I think is inherently an unsound structure, not a basis for business, which is not to have a good product, but to be as good as your last fry. I think that's the wrong approach, and frankly, I think what we're promoting is the opposite of socialism, and really is the basis of democracy, and frankly, the basis of capitalism.
Lane, thank you. I want to make sure I'm not getting the signal right. You need to speak into the microphone?
Sorry.
I see. That great answer was lost to all eternity because...
You all didn't hear it? Should I do it?
Did you get the response? I think the questioner got the response, and that's a good start.
Why don't I give a 1 minute for, just 1 minute,
okay,
since
sure,
I tend
please.
to go too long. The questioner was, did I think what we're doing is sort of going back to socialism? And my answer was, I think it's the absolute opposite. I think what we're trying to do is promote capitalism and promote democracy through transparency and through the quality of the product, the quality of the price, the quality of the hard work. We reward those, and we don't reward under the table bribery.
Sure, please.
Just to add something, quickly to that, I think one of the most remarkable things about compliance structures and what governments have asked for is the cumbersomeness comes from the interpretation, not from the demands. For this presentation, I put together for myself a summary of what the U.S. sentencing guidelines, the UK Bribery Act, and the OECD Good Practice Guidance ask of companies. This is literally it. All three can fit on 2 pages. And in fact, I think in many ways it's a vote of confidence in business to figure out the specifics rather than a demand for a bunch of specific requirements.
Great question and wonderful answers. Yes, please.
First of all, I would like to tell you thank you, all of you, for your presentations. It was very interesting for me. And most of all, I like those...
That might help. Thank you.
Okay. Most of all, I like those presentations which contain concrete examples of establishing compliance function here in Russia, in multinational companies. And I think that it is not a secret for you that Russian legislation doesn't contain any requirement to create a compliance function within an organization. And majority of Russian companies even doesn't know what does compliance means. And that's why for me it's interesting. Do you have any concrete examples how creating compliance function in Russia help you here in Russia?
That's a great question. In fact, I was going to ask something similar, and that is, as you respond to this question, and Eckhard and Paul, perhaps in your joint venture experience, the two of you might want to take this, to share anything from your experience in bringing your company's approach to compliance to the relationship, and what the joint venture partner's reaction was to that, and whether or not that was particularly difficult.
Yeah, if I may start first. Right from the early stages, we told our joint venture partner how important compliance and the structures that we have on a global scale are. But then when we, of course, had formed the joint venture, and when we did exactly what everyone from us also said, this tone from the top, when we had presentations, when we talked to the board, when we cascaded the information down, then yes, I think it was very interesting for our joint venture partner to see what they actually had subscribed to. Probably they did not, before they signed the joint venture agreement, had this in-depth knowledge, what that all means, what the structures are that we will implement in such a joint venture, what it means, also from the efforts that we have to undertake, from going out, doing classroom trainings, telling their employees, especially those coming from our joint venture partner. So that for them it was probably something that was new, but they appreciate that. Just recent example, we have the London Olympic Games, we have the European Football Championship coming up, and these are times where suppliers also come and invite, and we felt it was necessary again to make a targeted communication about specific this. What are the rules for our employees to keep them out of trouble, to avoid conflict of interest? And again, our joint venture partner was surprised that we do this, but they understand, and in the meantime you can really see how they appreciate that we do this and roll out information, cascading information from the top into the organization so that everyone has to understand what the values are that everyone has to follow.
Paul, do you want to add anything quickly to that?
Well, just my observations inside our joint venture that this has really caught on in the last probably 18 months, 2 years, so that now when I go out to lead seminars with businesses, it's such a strong leadership presence and leadership of the discussions that we have, such that people ask questions and it's somebody else in the audience that's giving the answer. You know, I don't even have to give the answers to these things. They're working it out for themselves, which is really great. In TNKBP, there was a time up until about 2007 when there was about 200 BP, heritage or secondee people there, and I think you could probably say that they were the leaders of this subject, and since they've all gone, you know, it's really the company itself that's got to take it on. And they have done, such that, for example, my boss meets with German Khan every week to discuss internal control and ethical issues.
I'm going to make a decision as the moderator to be non-compliant and not stop right at the moment, even though our time is 2 hours, because I don't see anybody making us stop. We have some questions, so we'll continue for a few more minutes. We got started late, and I think this is a good discussion, so please.
Many of you, I think, have touched on this point in the presentations already, but I was just wondering the difference between businesses and the kind and scope of compliance programs that you have to put in place, because we've got at least 3 types of business represented here in the panel, and all large companies, though. Thinking about that, and I have experience working with a bank and the kinds of compliance programs that have to go through for that. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the differences in what you're looking at, what are the priorities in putting together a compliance program, and you know, how that depends on, you know, the kind of business it is and the size.
So your question goes to the issue of the different sectors, energy versus life sciences versus consumer products. And can I tack on to your question in particular that this, when you talk about business and the balance between the goals of business and compliance, how you overcome that to some extent in getting the business to go along. And Doug, perhaps you can start this. You know, if you're going to end a relationship with a distributor, you're going to make a big impact on somebody's productivity in that business. And that's got to be a huge hurdle. And perhaps you can talk about that. But again, that's in the context of life sciences, which is a sector that has its own unique challenges. And we'll kind of hit energy and maybe consumer products here real quickly. So go ahead, Doug.
I think probably the aspect that makes the life sciences or pharmaceutical area you know, kind of interesting or dynamic in this space is that most doctors work in state hospitals and therefore can be considered, and often are considered, foreign officials, which means that every time a a sales representative from Pfizer walks into a doctor's office anywhere other than the United States, there's the likelihood that there's an interaction there that could be deemed a transaction with a foreign official. We pay doctors all around the world to do a lot of different things for us. So making sure every single one of those transactions goes well just generates a scale that is very, very large and a little overwhelming and the like. But I guess in some ways that's actually to our advantage, right? We're not saying, okay, there's just 7 of you out of our 100,000 employees who are interacting with foreign officials, just make sure you get it right. We all are. So putting aside our manufacturing and R&D colleagues, the sales force is a critical part of what we're doing. You guys are interacting with foreign officials. It's incredibly important work. We've got to make sure we're doing it right every single time. That's our expectation. And if it doesn't go the way we're expecting it to go, there are going to be significant consequences. And just to the point I made before, quickly, it's while that gives us a good momentum and motivation, it's what makes it very hard, though, too, because every system and control has to be right. And getting it right is I think, a really significant challenge.
Victoria, would you like to speak about the energy sector?
Еще раз повторюсь.
I'll say once again that when we started this company, I had to persuade the top management, in the necessity of such control and to increase it because it will give positive effect and results. I believe it's not important how it will be called, what the name of it, compliance or auditing. The goals and functions are the same, to save companies money. I was in my practice, I believe that since we have quite an expanded activity, we have a lot of corruption manifestations, and we have to bring it to order and control and risk control. These are specifics of our company, peculiarities of our company's purchasing activity, why we put greatest efforts in this area, and we try to control it more and more in order to make it more transparent and thus to educate employees changing their attitude. Inga,
yes, I probably would like to add, because working in a diversified company, so I see really difference between businesses. And this is very interesting because, and I think that's one of the reasons why GE keeps businesses quite independent and separately, and having compliance structure also for businesses, still keeping it, plus having corporate compliance structure. And really there is sense here, because if we look at healthcare, it's really one thing, and Doug has mentioned that there is a lot of interaction with the government here, so, or with people who are government public officials from FCPA point of view. If we talk about other businesses, it could also depend on different business models that businesses may have. If we sell turbines, it's big product, we can go direct. If we sell some small product, a small valve, it most likely will be part of a bigger package, and that's the reason to go through intermediary. And intermediary means higher risk for the company. That's why we need to address it differently. Plus, of course, regulatory environment is different for different businesses. And in this sense, the companies who are intermediaries, not business intermediaries, but intermediaries to get some licenses, etc., could be absolutely, we cannot do with this, and this brings another risk. That's why it should be addressed, specifically addressed within this business. And plus, so it's not addressing your question, but still it could be related to the different risks that we may have, not only in different businesses, but in different regions. To addressing different risks in regions, we have corporate structure, we have geographical structure. And there also we have compliance resources, compliance departments, and specific compliance procedures to address these risks.
Thank you, Inga. Ed, you can have the last question.
Thank you. Ed Rubikishenko, Baker McKinsey, Moscow. I would disagree that Russian law is a bit different from FCPA because Russia is a party to OECD convention, which is also known like international FCPA. And first stage was already passed. And basically, officers of OECD said that Russian law is very similar and comply fully. And according to Russian administrative code, the only defense you have is measures which are very similar to United States approach. And my question is to Lenny. Now we have in place our Russian rules, and the officers who will be responsible are the prosecutors, but they don't have experience yet. Do you have in your agenda any ideas that you may share your experience on how to prosecute these offenses?
So first, we have had great dealings with our Russian friends. I've been at the Ministry of Justice. I see some of our RLAs here, resident legal advisors who are exceptional in their training programs. In the review for the OECD, the United States will be here in Russia working with you on the implementation. And I also accept the fact that in our own country there was an evolution. The FCPA is a 1970 statute that was created in the aftermath of Watergate, and the perception then by our government that there was corruption was more pervasive than it should be, that our companies were bribing foreign officials. And for the first years, this statute really wasn't implemented. We weren't, in fact, prosecuting it. And then we only started to do it slowly. And then we only did it against companies on a sporadic basis. And then we started prosecuting companies or investigating companies more thoroughly and more comprehensively. And now we've evolved to the point that we're holding both companies and executives accountable. So I understand there's an evolution. My hope is that other countries, since we were in the lead, are able to go through that process, that evolutionary process, far more and far quicker. But in the same way that you've heard from Doug and everyone here that a company has to really want it, that there has to be a real belief by the business leaders that they're going to walk away from business, that it's really adopted. The same has to be true for the government that enacts legislation. The mere fact that legislation is on the books is, of course, necessary, but it's far from sufficient. The government, the prosecutors, the investigators, have to also believe in this, have to feel empowered, have to feel supported by their superiors, and I'm very hopeful that that'll happen here as we're seeing it happening in other parts of the world. And the United States remains ready to be a partner with our friends in Russia, to work with them operationally, to work with them in training, and that's why we have resident legal advisors and others, and why the Attorney General and I and others keep coming back.
Well, that's a great concluding note. And with that, I want to thank all of you here today for your attendance and for your questions. We appreciate your interest. And I especially want to thank our panel. The panel has made a real effort to be here and to offer their perspectives. It's been a very interesting experience for me to hear all these different perspectives shared, and for the great work that each person here is doing. And so if I might ask all of you to help me in thanking our panel for their presentation.